Everyone in London believed the Duke could not desire a woman. By midnight, they were terrified of how wrong they had been. The whispers began before Seraphina Vale even stepped out of the carriage. They drifted through the cold October air like smoke curling beneath a locked door. Soft at first, amused, curious, cruel in the careful way aristocrats preferred their cruelty delivered. The lamps outside Blackthorn Cathedral burned gold against the evening fog. Their light slid across polished black carriages, jeweled gowns, silver walking canes, and the marble steps crowded with noble families who had arrived not for a wedding, but for a spectacle. Seraphina kept her eyes lowered as the footman opened the carriage door. Her gloved fingers tightened once around the edge of her cloak before she released it. She had practiced that movement in private. Control first. Always control first. They're all staring, her younger sister whispered beside her. Lydia sounded pale with panic. Seraphina stepped down carefully onto the stone. Of course they are, she said quietly. London enjoys disasters. A ripple moved through the crowd the moment her face became visible beneath the ivory veil. Not admiration, not warmth, something sharper, pity mixed with fascination. She heard fragments immediately. Poor thing. Her father sold her for debt. Imagine spending a lifetime untouched. They say he has never once shared a bed with a woman. I heard he cannot stand being looked at. No, worse. I heard he prefers men. The final sentence landed closest. Seraphina did not react. Years of surviving aristocratic society had taught her that humiliation became deadlier the moment others saw it wound you. She continued walking toward the cathedral steps with measured grace, her white satin skirts brushing softly against the stone. Behind her, her father climbed from the carriage without offering his hand. Edmund Vale looked exhausted already. He had spent the last 3 months gambling away what remained of their estate. This marriage had not been arranged from affection or loyalty. It had been arranged because Ravensshire money would prevent the Vale family from collapsing before winter. Seraphina understood that perfectly. She had understood it the moment her father entered the drawing room 2 weeks ago with trembling hands and refused to meet her eyes. The Duke has agreed, he had said. Not asked. Agreed. As though her life had become a transaction finalized between men over brandy and legal papers. The cathedral bells rang once overhead. Deep, hollow, final. Seraphina climbed the first step. Then another. Her breathing remained steady, but she could feel hundreds of eyes studying her every movement. Waiting for weakness. Waiting for signs of fear. Waiting for the bride condemned to the strange Duke of Ravensshire to finally realize what everyone else already believed. That she had been sacrificed. Lady Victoria Hollowmere stood near the cathedral entrance wrapped in crimson velvet and diamonds bright enough to wound the eye. Her beauty was famous across London. So was her appetite for destruction. She smiled slowly as Seraphina approached. Miss Vale, Victoria said sweetly. Or should I say your grace? Seraphina stopped. Lady Hollowmere. Victoria tilted her head. You look nervous. Do I? A little. Victoria's gaze drifted meaningfully toward the cathedral doors. Though perhaps there is nothing to fear. After all, your wedding night may prove far less demanding than most brides endure. Several nearby ladies covered their smiles behind lace fans. One gentleman looked down immediately into his gloves. Seraphina felt the insult arrive exactly as Victoria intended. Public, elegant, poisoned. She looked directly at the other woman for the first time. You seem unusually invested in my marriage. Victoria's smile sharpened. London has been invested in the Duke for years. Then London should find a healthier hobby. A brief silence followed. Tiny. Dangerous. Victoria blinked once, clearly surprised. Seraphina inclined her head politely and continued toward the cathedral entrance before the other woman could answer. Behind her, the whispers rose louder. Not because she had won. Women like Victoria never lost publicly. But because she had refused to break. Inside, the cathedral glowed with candlelight and old stone shadows. The scent of wax and winter roses filled the air. Noble families occupied the front pews in dark silks and jewels, while farther back lesser aristocrats leaned subtly into the aisles, eager for a better view of the scandal. Serafina walked slowly down the long aisle beside her father. The organ played softly overhead. She kept her eyes forward until she reached the altar. Then she saw him. Duke Lucian Ravensheir stood perfectly still beneath the cathedral arches, dressed entirely in black formal evening clothes. Tall, broad-shouldered, severe in a way that made every other nobleman nearby appear unfinished. His expression revealed nothing. Not anticipation. Not irritation. Not even curiosity. The candlelight touched the sharp line of his jaw, and the silver threaded faintly through his dark hair near the temples. He looked less like a bridegroom than a man attending an execution he had already accepted. Serafina felt something strange then. Not fear. Not disappointment. Recognition. Because for the first time since this engagement began, she understood why London feared him enough to invent stories. Men like Lucian Ravensheir unsettled society because silence around that kind of power forced others to fill the emptiness themselves. Rumors became easier than truth. He looked at her once as she approached the altar. Just once. But the weight of it settled low in her chest with startling force. His eyes were gray. Not soft gray. Storm gray. Controlled gray. The kind of eyes that appeared calm only because violence beneath them had already been mastered. He did not smile when she reached him. "Miss Vale," he said quietly. His voice was deeper than she expected. Smooth, controlled, entirely unreadable. "Your Grace." The bishop began the ceremony. The words echoed through the cathedral while candle flames trembled softly in the draught. Serafina answered each vow clearly. Lucian answered his without hesitation. Yet something felt wrong. Not with the ceremony itself. With the room. The atmosphere pressed too tightly against her skin. Like everyone present was waiting for some invisible disaster to unfold. She noticed it most when the bishop instructed Lucian to lift her veil. A hush moved across the cathedral instantly. Even the whispers stopped. Lucian reached toward her slowly. His fingers paused for the smallest fraction of a second before touching the veil near her temple. That single hesitation changed everything. Not because it revealed weakness. Because it revealed restraint. Serafina felt it immediately. The careful control in the movement. The deliberate distance. His hand brushed the side of her face as he lifted the veil fully away. The contact lasted less than a second. It still sent a strange heat through the cold center of the cathedral. Lucian's gaze held hers afterward. Steady. Silent. Watching. Then he lowered his hand and the ceremony continued. But the room no longer felt amused. Felt alert. As though London had just noticed the first crack in a story it had repeated for years. Outside, snow began falling softly over the cathedral steps. Inside, the Duke of Ravensheir looked at his new wife like a man trying very hard not to reveal something dangerous. The reception at Ravensheir House began precisely 40 minutes after the ceremony ended because Lucian Ravensheir was known to despise lateness almost as much as gossip. Yet tonight London intended to indulge in both. Snow gathered softly along the black iron gates as carriage after carriage arrived beneath the towering stone arches of the estate. Footmen in dark formal coats moved with military precision through the marble entrance hall while guests surrendered their cloaks and immediately lowered their voices into eager whispers. Serafina stood at the top of the grand staircase beside her husband and watched society rearrange itself around them like pieces on a chessboard. The ballroom below blazed with candlelight reflected in mirrored walls nearly 20 feet high. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead like frozen stars. Music drifted through the room from a string quartet positioned near the eastern balcony, elegant enough to soften tension without ever erasing it. Lucian had not spoken more than 6 words to her since the ceremony. Not because he appeared cold. Coldness suggested indifference. This felt different, deliberate, measured. As though every movement he made passed first through layers of internal control before reaching the outside world. "Smile slightly," her mother murmured beside her before retreating toward the guests. "You look too calm." Serafina almost laughed at that. Calm had become her armor years ago. Without it she would never have survived London society long enough to stand here now wearing the Ravensheir diamonds against her throat. Lucian extended his arm without looking at her directly. She placed her gloved hand lightly against his sleeve and together they descended the staircase into a room waiting for collapse. The crowd parted immediately. Men bowed. Women curtsied. Conversation shifted and fractured wherever they passed. Serafina noticed the way guests studied Lucien more carefully tonight than before, watching for signs, watching for discomfort, watching for proof that years of rumors still held power over him. But the Duke moved through the ballroom with complete composure. His expression remained controlled. His shoulders remained loose beneath the black evening coat tailored perfectly across his frame. Nothing about him suggested fear, and somehow that unsettled the room more than scandal ever could. "Your Grace." Lord Ashcombe appeared first, smiling too quickly. "Allow me to offer congratulations." Lucien inclined his head once. "Thank you." Ashcombe turned toward Serafina with visible curiosity. "The entire city is discussing your wedding." "That sounds exhausting for the city," she replied. A faint sound escaped Lucien then. Not laughter exactly. More dangerous than laughter. Amusement carefully restrained. Ashcombe blinked, clearly uncertain whether the Duke had nearly smiled or whether he imagined it entirely. The older man excused himself moments later. Others replaced him immediately. Nobles, politicians, ladies wrapped in silk and jewels heavy enough to feed villages for years. They approached with polished manners and hungry eyes. Serafina answered every question with calm precision while beside her Lucien remained mostly silent. Yet she became increasingly aware of something strange. He watched everything. Not broadly, specifically. The moment a gentleman stepped too close during conversation, Lucien shifted slightly beside her. The moment a drunken viscount allowed his gaze to linger too long on her neckline, the Duke looked at him once and the man immediately retreated toward the champagne table. Nothing overt happened. That was what made it unsettling. Lucien Ravensheyer controlled rooms without appearing to move at all. "You seem surprised." The voice came quietly near her ear as another wave of guests drifted away. Serafina turned slightly toward him. "About what?" "You keep studying me when you think I will not notice." His gaze remained fixed ahead on the ballroom. She felt heat rise unexpectedly beneath her collarbone. "Perhaps I am trying to understand my husband." "And have you succeeded?" "No." A pause followed. Brief. Heavy. "Good," he said softly. The musicians began a waltz. Couples slowly filled the ballroom floor beneath the chandeliers while servants circulated with silver trays of champagne and winterberries glazed in sugar. Serafina accepted a crystal glass mostly to occupy her hands. Across the room she noticed Lady Victoria Hollowmere watching them with narrowed eyes sharp as polished glass. Victoria stood surrounded by admirers in dark crimson silk, beautiful enough to command attention even in a room overflowing with titled women. Yet her focus never left Lucien for long. Serafina noticed something else as well. Victoria appeared irritated. Not heartbroken. Not jealous. Irritated. As though events tonight had disrupted expectations carefully arranged in advance. "Lady Hollowmere dislikes surprises," Lucien said suddenly. Serafina nearly dropped her glass. "You read minds now?" "Only obvious expressions." He finally looked directly at her then. Close enough for her to notice the faint shadow beneath his eyes. The exhaustion hidden carefully under perfect posture. "You should eat something," he added quietly. "You have barely touched your plate all evening." The observation startled her more than it should have. "You noticed." "I notice everything in my house." Again that strange feeling moved through her. Not fear. Awareness. The kind that sharpened breathing and slowed thoughts simultaneously. Before she could answer, Lady Victoria approached. The ballroom seemed to sense her arrival immediately. Nearby conversations softened. Fans stilled. Even the musicians appeared quieter somehow beneath the weight of anticipation moving through the room. Victoria curtsied gracefully before Lucien. "Your Grace." "Lady Hollowmere." His tone cooled by several degrees. Victoria smiled anyway. "You look remarkably well tonight. I was unaware my health concerned you. London has always been concerned with you." Her gaze drifted toward Serafina. "And now naturally it concerns the Duchess as well." Serafina set her untouched champagne glass onto a passing tray. "How generous of society." Victoria ignored her completely. "I admit," she continued softly to Lucien, Many people expected you might avoid a public reception altogether. Silence settled briefly around them. Lucien's expression did not change. Did they? Of course, considering your long preference for privacy. Victoria's voice remained perfectly elegant, perfectly poisonous. Some men simply find these displays uncomfortable. Serafina finally understood. Victoria was testing him publicly, pushing carefully against the oldest rumors in London while forcing him either to retreat or react. Lucien looked at the other woman for several seconds, then calmly reached toward Serafina. His gloved hand settled lightly against the bare skin at the center of her back above the silver ribbon of her gown. The contact lasted only a moment, yet the effect inside the ballroom was immediate. Silence spread outward almost visibly through the nearest guests, because nothing about the gesture appeared forced. Nothing about it suggested performance. It looked instinctive, possessive. Lucien's gaze never left Victoria. "My wife does not seem uncomfortable," he said quietly. Serafina felt his hand withdraw slowly afterward. Heat remained behind where he touched her. Victoria's smile flickered for the first time that evening. Tiny, nearly invisible. But Serafina saw it. So did Lucien. "How reassuring," Victoria replied smoothly. "London will sleep easier tonight." She curtsied once more and disappeared back into the crowd before anyone could respond. The music resumed fully. Conversations rose again. Yet something fundamental inside the ballroom had shifted. Serafina could feel it in the altered glances following them now. Less mockery, more uncertainty. The Duke turned toward her slightly. "You should be careful around Lady Hollowmere. Because she dislikes me? Because she rarely dislikes anyone without purpose." Before Serafina could ask what that meant, a servant approached quietly from the edge of the ballroom. "Your Grace." Lucien looked toward him immediately. "What is it?" "There is an issue regarding the West Wing preparations." The servant looked nervous. Lucien's jaw tightened once. "Barely noticeable. I will handle it." He turned toward Serafina. "Remain here. Am I under guard already?" Another flicker of restrained amusement crossed his face. "No. But this house contains too many people who enjoy stories." Then he walked away through the ballroom crowd with measured steps that caused conversations to break apart in his wake. Serafina watched him disappear beyond the western corridor beneath the gold candlelight. For the first time that evening she realized something deeply unsettling. The rumors about Lucien Ravensheyer had hidden the wrong danger entirely. London believed the Duke incapable of desire because distance frightened people less than intensity. But Serafina had begun to notice the truth beneath his restraint. Every glance he gave her felt controlled only by force. And men who mastered themselves that carefully were often the most dangerous once control finally broke. Serafina remained near the edge of the ballroom for several minutes after Lucien disappeared into the western corridor. Around her, society slowly resumed breathing. Laughter returned in careful bursts. Crystal glasses touched softly together beneath the chandeliers. Musicians continued the waltz with polished elegance, though the room still felt altered somehow. Like guests were no longer certain which version of the Duke of Ravensheyer stood before them tonight. That uncertainty disturbed them more than scandal ever had. "Your Grace." Serafina turned at the sound of the voice. An older woman approached dressed in dark silver silk with pearls woven through carefully pinned white hair. The Duchess of Blackmore. Widowed. Influential. Known for surviving 40 years of aristocratic politics without once losing public composure. "Duchess," Serafina greeted politely. The older woman studied her quietly for a moment. "You are calmer than most brides would be tonight." Most brides probably married men they understood. A faint smile touched the corners of the Duchess's mouth. No woman fully understands a Ravensheyer before marriage. Serafina noticed that immediately. Before marriage. Not ever. "You have known His Grace a long time?" "Since he was a boy." The Duchess accepted a champagne glass from a passing servant but did not drink from it. London prefers inventing stories about men who refuse to entertain them. Lucien learned that lesson very young. And are the stories false? The older woman's gaze shifted briefly toward the western corridor where Lucien vanished moments earlier. The dangerous thing about rumors, she said quietly, is that people become so distracted asking whether they are true that they stop asking who benefits from them. Before Serafina could respond, the Duchess inclined her head gracefully and moved away into the crowd, leaving behind only confusion and the faint scent of lavender perfume. Serafina stood still for several seconds afterward. Her fingers brushed unconsciously against the silver ring now resting on her left hand beneath her glove. Heavy, cold, permanent. Somewhere behind her, laughter rose too sharply near the gaming tables. Across the ballroom, Victoria Hollowmere continued entertaining admirers while occasionally glancing toward the western corridor with visible impatience. Serafina noticed that as well. Whatever was happening tonight, Victoria expected involvement in it. A servant approached quietly near her shoulder. "Your Grace." "Yes." "His Grace requested that you be escorted upstairs once the second waltz concludes." Serafina looked toward the orchestra. The second waltz had already begun. "Did he explain why?" "No, Your Grace. Of course not." She thanked the servant softly and allowed herself one final glance across the ballroom before following him toward the grand staircase. The upper corridors of Ravensshire House felt entirely different from the glittering spectacle below. Quiet, dimly lit. The carpets muted footsteps while portraits of dead ancestors watched from dark paneled walls beneath candle sconces flickering against polished mahogany. Serafina walked carefully behind the servant through a long eastern hallway lined with tall windows overlooking the snow-covered gardens. "Does His Grace often host receptions this large?" she asked. The servant hesitated almost imperceptibly. "No, Your Grace. He dislikes society?" "His Grace dislikes unnecessary attention." The answer sounded practiced, repeated many times before. They stopped outside a pair of tall double doors carved from black walnut wood. The servant bowed slightly. "His Grace's private sitting room." Then he retreated immediately, leaving Serafina alone in the corridor. For one strange moment she considered turning back downstairs. Instead she lifted her hand and opened the door. Warmth greeted her first, then silence. The room beyond stretched larger than expected beneath dark green walls lined floor to ceiling with bookshelves nearly 15 feet high. A fire burned steadily inside the marble hearth while rain tapped softly against distant windows somewhere deeper in the suite. No servants waited nearby. No sound came from the adjoining chambers. The room felt intensely private in a way the ballroom never could. Serafina stepped farther inside slowly. A decanter of untouched whiskey rested beside crystal glasses near the fireplace. Several letters lay neatly arranged across a massive walnut desk. Everything appeared controlled, ordered, exact. Yet she noticed small disruptions almost immediately. One chair near the fire sat angled slightly away from the others, as though someone abandoned it abruptly earlier that evening. A riding glove remained carelessly discarded beside the desk. Most strangely of all, a woman's book rested open near the window seat. Poetry. The pages showed faint signs of repeated reading. Serafina moved closer slowly. The realization unsettled her more than it should have. This did not feel like the room of a man indifferent to women. It felt like the room of someone who concealed parts of himself with exhausting precision. A quiet sound behind her made her turn instantly. Lucien stood in the doorway. He had removed his formal coat sometime downstairs. The black waistcoat beneath fitted closely across his shoulders while the white collar at his throat had loosened slightly, revealing the first visible signs of fatigue all evening. Yet his gaze remained completely alert. It settled briefly on the poetry book near her hand. "You may read it if you wish," he said quietly. Serafina stepped back immediately. "I was not searching through your things." "I know." He closed the door behind him with measured calm. The sound echoed softly through the room. "Most people would have opened the desk drawers first." "And most people interest you?" A flicker crossed his expression then. Again that restrained almost smile she could never fully predict. Lucien crossed toward the fireplace while removing his gloves one finger at a time. Serafina watched the movement before looking away quickly. There was something dangerous about observing him too closely. Not because he encouraged attention, because he appeared constantly aware of it. "You handled Lady Hollowmere well tonight," he said. "Was I being evaluated?" Everyone in that ballroom was being evaluated. He set the gloves carefully beside the decanter. Victoria expected humiliation. You disappointed her. She seems disappointed often. Lucien looked at her then. Fully this time. Not often enough. Silence settled between them afterward. Not awkward. Heavy. The fire crackled softly nearby while snow continued falling outside the dark windows. Serafina became increasingly conscious of how alone they truly were for the first time since the wedding began. No ballroom. No guests. No orchestra softening tension with music. Just the Duke watching her from across the room with those controlled gray eyes that never seemed to miss anything. Why did you marry me? The question escaped before she could reconsider it. Lucien did not answer immediately. He poured water into a crystal glass instead and handed it toward her calmly. You should drink something. That is not an answer. No, she accepted the glass anyway because refusing suddenly felt childish. Then answer me properly. Lucien leaned one shoulder lightly against the fireplace mantel. Firelight moved across the sharp angles of his face, softening nothing. Your father needed money. That explains him. Not you. Most aristocratic marriages are transactions. Most aristocratic marriages are not surrounded by rumors that the groom cannot tolerate his own bride. His gaze sharpened slightly at that. Not anger. Awareness. And does that concern you? Should it? Another silence followed. Longer this time. Lucien looked briefly toward the fire before speaking again. You are very direct for someone society considers quiet. Quiet women usually hear more than men realize. That nearly startled him. She saw it immediately in the subtle shift near his eyes. Then he looked down once at the untouched whiskey beside him. London mistakes silence for weakness, he said softly. It is often the opposite. Something about the sentence felt personal. Deeply personal. Serafina studied him more carefully now. The exhaustion beneath his posture. The endless restraint. The way every word appeared selected with dangerous precision before leaving his mouth. Suddenly the rumors made less sense than ever. Men hiding shame tended to overperform confidence. Lucien did the opposite. He withdrew constantly, controlled constantly, as though concealment itself had become survival. Lady Hollowmere cares about your reputation more than seems natural, Serafina observed carefully. Lucien's expression cooled almost instantly. Victoria cares about influence. Reputation is merely the easiest tool. Were you close? He held her gaze for several seconds. No, the answer arrived too quickly. Not false exactly. Incomplete. Before Serafina could press further, movement outside the windows caught her attention. A distant flash of lantern light crossed the snow-covered courtyard below. She stepped closer to the glass instinctively. Several stable hands moved hurriedly through the storm carrying luggage toward the east carriage house. Someone is leaving? She asked. Lucien joined her near the window, close enough now that she became aware of the faint scent of cedar and winter air clinging to his clothes. Lady Hollowmere, he said quietly. She never stays where she is no longer in control. Serafina looked down toward the courtyard again, just as Victoria herself emerged beneath the lantern glow wrapped in dark velvet furs. For one brief moment the other woman stopped beside her carriage and looked upward directly toward the windows of Lucien's private chambers. Their eyes met across the snow. Victoria's expression did not contain heartbreak, contained warning. Then she entered the carriage and disappeared into the storm. Beside Serafina, Lucien went very still. Not tense. Worse than tense. Controlled. The kind of stillness a person learned only after years spent mastering dangerous emotions before they reached the surface. And for the first time since this marriage began, Serafina realized something far more unsettling than any rumor London ever invented. Lucien Ravenshayer was not afraid of desire. He was afraid of what desire turned him into once he allowed himself to feel it. The clock in the eastern hallway struck midnight just as the storm outside deepened into heavy snow. Ravenshayer House had grown quieter over the past hour. Most guests remained downstairs drinking champagne beneath the chandeliers while smaller groups gathered inside drawing rooms to dissect the wedding with the relentless hunger only aristocrats possessed. Yet the upper floor remained silent except for the soft crackle of the fire and the distant wind pressing against the windows. Serafina stood beside the glass watching snow gather across the dark gardens below, while Lucien remained near the fireplace behind her. Neither spoke for several moments. The silence between them no longer felt empty, felt observant, careful, like two people slowly recognizing the outlines of something neither entirely understood yet. "You should rest soon," Lucien said at last. Serafina turned from the window. "You sound relieved by the idea." "I sound practical. There is a difference?" A faint shadow of amusement touched his face again. It appeared briefly enough to make her wonder whether she imagined it entirely. "You dislike easy answers," he observed. "Easy answers are usually lies." That earned her a longer look. Lucien crossed slowly toward the desk near the fire and picked up one of the sealed letters resting there earlier. His fingers tapped once against the folded paper before setting it back down unopened. A habit, perhaps, or restraint. Everything about him seemed built from restraint. "You are tired," he said quietly without looking at her. "You have spoken to half of London tonight while being examined like an artifact behind glass. You noticed that too?" "I notice when people stare at what belongs to me." The sentence settled into the room heavily. Serafina felt her breath pause for one brief second before recovering. Lucien seemed to realize what he said only afterward. His jaw tightened slightly. "I meant," he corrected calmly, "the Duchess of Ravensshire attracts attention." Of course. But neither of them fully believed the correction. Lucien moved toward the side table near the fire and poured fresh water into another crystal glass. His movements remained steady, controlled. Yet Serafina had begun noticing tiny fractures beneath that control tonight. Small pauses, the occasional tightening near his mouth, the way his gaze lingered half a second too long before retreating again. Most men would not have concealed such things successfully. Lucien concealed them so well that every crack became impossible to ignore once seen. A knock interrupted the room softly. Lucien's expression cooled instantly. "Enter." An older servant stepped carefully inside carrying a folded garment draped over one arm. Tall, thin, silver-haired. His posture contained the polished dignity of someone who had served old aristocratic families long enough to witness generations destroy themselves politely. "Your Grace," the servant said quietly. "Mrs. Whitmore asked that the Duchess receive this before the guests depart." Lucien nodded once. "Thank you, Hargrove." The servant approached Serafina respectfully and offered the folded garment. A cloak of deep midnight blue velvet lined with silver silk. Beautiful enough to belong in a royal collection. Serafina touched the fabric lightly. "This is extraordinary." "It belonged to the former Duchess," Hargrove explained. "His Grace requested it be prepared for you this afternoon." Serafina looked immediately toward Lucien. "You ordered this?" The weather turned colder. His answer arrived too quickly again. Practical, controlled, entirely inadequate beside the reality of the gesture itself. Hargrove's eyes moved discreetly between them before lowering respectfully. "Will there be anything further tonight, Your Grace?" "No," the servant inclined his head and withdrew quietly from the room, closing the door behind him with practiced silence. Serafina held the velvet cloak against her hands for several seconds afterward. "You prepared this before the ceremony?" "Yes." "Why?" Lucien walked toward the windows slowly, stopping beside her at a careful distance. Snow continued falling beyond the glass in thick white waves beneath the courtyard lanterns. "Because Ravensshire winters are unforgiving," he said, "and because no one should enter this house feeling unwelcome." The words sounded simple. They should not have affected her so strongly. Yet they did. Because no one had prepared anything for Serafina Vale in years unless duty demanded it. Kindness arranged quietly in advance felt far more dangerous than cruelty. Cruelty she understood. "You continue surprising me," she admitted softly. Lucien's reflection shifted faintly in the dark window beside hers. "That concerns you." "I have not decided yet." Another silence settled between them, closer now somehow. Serafina became aware of how near he stood beside her without touching her. Near enough that she could hear his breathing beneath the storm outside. near enough that warmth from his body faintly reached through the cold air near the windows. "What are you afraid of?" The question escaped her before caution could stop it. Lucien went still beside her, completely still. "Why would you ask that?" "Because every rumor about you feels wrong." He did not answer. Serafina continued carefully. "Men hiding shame behave differently. They overcompensate. They perform confidence loudly. But you—" She hesitated. "You act like someone containing something." Lucien looked down once toward his hands. "And what exactly do you believe I am containing?" The honesty of the question unsettled her. "I do not know." "Good." There was no cruelty in the answer, only exhaustion. Lucien turned away from the window and crossed slowly toward the fire again. Serafina watched him loosen the white cuffs at his wrists with deliberate calm. The movement exposed strong hands marked faintly with old scars near the knuckles. Not fresh, not violent. Simply the signs of a man who carried more responsibility than comfort throughout his life. "When my father died," Lucien said suddenly, "I inherited Ravensshire at 21 years old." Serafina remained silent. He rarely volunteered personal information. There were debts, political expectations, family obligations. Everyone wanted something immediately. His voice stayed even. The easiest way to survive was distance. Firelight moved across the side of his face as he spoke. Distance becomes habit after enough years. "And the rumors?" Lucien's mouth tightened slightly. "Rumors become useful when they keep people away." Serafina stared at him quietly. Suddenly pieces began shifting together inside her mind. Not complete answers. Worse than answers. Partial truths. "You let London believe them intentionally." "I allowed London to believe whatever kept Ravensshire stable. Even if it destroyed your reputation?" His eyes lifted toward hers then. Calm. Direct. "Reputation is only valuable when a man still cares what society thinks of him." Something in the sentence felt deeply lonely. Before she could respond, distant laughter drifted faintly upward from the ballroom below. The reception continued. The world continued. Yet inside this room the atmosphere had changed entirely. Lucien no longer felt like a cold mystery arranged behind scandal. He felt like a man who had spent years building walls so carefully that even he no longer remembered how to lower them without damage. Serafina moved slowly toward the fire, the velvet cloak still gathered lightly in her hands. "And now?" she asked quietly. "Now what?" "Now you are married." Lucien watched her for several seconds. The fire reflected softly in his gray eyes. "Now," he said at last, "London will begin looking for cracks in things it does not understand. Will it find them?" His gaze dropped briefly to the wedding ring on her gloved hand, then returned slowly to her face. "That depends," he said softly, "on whether you intend to become my ally or my weakness." The room fell silent afterward except for the storm beyond the windows. Serafina felt something shift low in her chest then. Not fear. Not trust. Recognition. Because for the first time since entering Ravensshire House, she understood the real danger surrounding Lucien Ravensshire. It was not cruelty. It was intensity held under absolute control for so long that once released, even slightly, it threatened to consume everything around it. Serafina did not answer his question immediately. The fire burned low between them while snow struck softly against the tall windows overlooking the dark eastern gardens. Somewhere below, the reception continued beneath chandeliers and orchestras and carefully controlled gossip. But up here the silence had become sharper than conversation. Lucien remained near the fireplace watching her with the same unsettling stillness that seemed to define him. Not impatient. Never impatient. Simply observant in a way that made people feel visible whether they wished to be or not. "You assume those are the only two choices," Serafina said at last. "Ally or weakness?" Lucien's gaze shifted slightly. "Most people eventually become one or the other." "And which was Lady Hollowmere?" The question landed cleanly between them. Lucien did not react immediately, though she noticed his fingers tighten once against the edge of the mantle before relaxing again. "Neither," he said calmly. "Victoria prefers proximity to power, not people." "That sounds practiced." "It is true." Serafina studied him quietly. You still have not explained why she hates this marriage. Hate is emotional. Victoria is strategic. Then why did she look at me tonight as though I ruined something important? Lucian moved away from the fireplace slowly. Because uncertainty makes her uncomfortable. And I create uncertainty? No, his eyes held hers directly now. We do. The answer unsettled her more than she expected. Because he said it without hesitation. Without irony. As though whatever existed between them tonight had already altered the balance of something larger surrounding Ravensshire House. Before she could respond, another knock sounded softly at the door. Lucian's expression cooled again. Enter, Mrs. Whitmore stepped carefully inside carrying a silver tray with untouched tea service arranged beside a folded stack of correspondence. The housekeeper moved with rigid elegance, her dark gray dress immaculate despite the late hour. She glanced briefly toward Serafina before addressing Lucian. Most guests are preparing to depart, Your Grace. Good. Mrs. Whitmore hesitated slightly. There is one matter requiring attention. Lucian waited. Lord Ashcombe appears heavily intoxicated. He has been overheard discussing Your Grace's marriage in the smoking room. A faint stillness entered the room. Tiny. Dangerous. Serafina noticed it instantly. Lucian did not look angry. Anger would have been easier to understand. Instead, his entire posture became quieter somehow. More controlled. What precisely was said? He asked. Mrs. Whitmore lowered her eyes carefully. He suggested the marriage would remain ceremonial. Public speculation has become unrestrained. Serafina felt heat rise beneath her skin immediately. Not embarrassment. Fury. The humiliation was not even private enough to remain upstairs for one evening. Lucian remained silent for several seconds. Then he took the stack of correspondence from the tray and placed it unopened onto the desk beside him. Ensure Lord Ashcombe's carriage is prepared immediately. Yes, Your Grace. And Mrs. Whitmore. The older woman paused near the door. No guest discussing my wife disrespectfully will receive another invitation to Ravensshire House. Mrs. Whitmore blinked once. Understood, Your Grace. Then she withdrew silently from the room. The moment the door closed, Serafina looked toward Lucian. You did not need to do that. Yes, he said evenly. I did. People gossip. That is what society does. Not in my house. The sentence arrived low and controlled. Serafina felt the weight of it settle through the room immediately. Lucian crossed toward the side table again and poured tea into 2 cups with careful precision. The steam rose softly through the firelight. You are angry, he observed without looking up. Should I not be? Most people would pretend indifference. Most people are cowards. That finally drew a real reaction from him. Small but unmistakable. The corner of his mouth shifted faintly upward before disappearing again. There you are, he murmured almost to himself. Serafina frowned slightly. What does that mean? Lucian handed her one of the teacups carefully. Their fingers brushed for the briefest moment against the porcelain handle. Heat moved unexpectedly through her hand before vanishing again. All evening, he said quietly, you have behaved exactly as London expects a duchess to behave. And now you sound like yourself. The observation startled her more than it should have. Because he was right. Since arriving at Ravensshire House, she had measured every word, every glance, every reaction. Survival inside aristocratic society depended upon performance. Women who revealed too much became entertainment for everyone around them. Yet somehow Lucian continued noticing the moments she stopped performing. Serafina lowered her eyes briefly toward the untouched tea. You notice inconvenient things. Frequently. The fire crackled softly nearby. Outside, wind swept fresh snow against the windows in pale silver waves. Lucian remained standing close enough now that she could sense his presence even without looking directly at him. Not overwhelming. Focused. Like every inch of his attention settled deliberately where he chose to place it. Tell me something honestly, she said quietly. You assume I have not already. Did you expect this marriage to be easy? Lucian looked at her for several seconds before answering. No, Then why proceed with it? Because easy things rarely survive pressure. The response frustrated her instantly. That is not an answer either. It is the only one you are receiving tonight. Serafina exhaled slowly and set the teacup aside untouched. You enjoy withholding information. No, Lucien's voice softened slightly. I enjoy certainty. And I do not yet know which truths are safe to place in your hands. The honesty of that sentence caught her off guard. There was no manipulation in it. No cruelty. Only caution worn so long it had become instinct. You really do not trust anyone, she said. Lucien's gaze drifted briefly toward the dark windows. Trust is expensive. And loneliness is not? That hit him. She saw it immediately in the subtle tightening near his jaw before control returned once more. Neither spoke afterward. The silence stretched quietly between them while somewhere below the final guests began departing Ravensshire House. Carriage wheels rolled faintly across snow outside. Doors opened and closed in distant echoes beneath the storm. Eventually Lucien crossed toward the desk and selected one of the unopened letters from the stack. His eyes scanned the seal briefly before his expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Problem? Serafina asked. He folded the letter closed again. Nothing requiring your concern. That usually means the opposite. Lucien almost smiled again. Almost. You are persistent. I am observant. Dangerous combination. He placed the letter back onto the desk with measured calm, though something about his posture had shifted subtly. More alert now. More distant. Serafina moved closer instinctively. What happened? Lucien looked at her directly. A reminder, he said quietly, that London rarely allows peace to exist uninterrupted. Before she could press further, another sound echoed faintly through the corridor outside. Footsteps. Fast. Then the abrupt stop of someone hesitating beyond the door. Lucien's entire body went still instantly. Not alarmed. Prepared. A second later Hargrove entered without waiting for permission. Something the old servant clearly considered serious enough to ignore protocol entirely. Your Grace, he said carefully, breathing slightly harder than before. There is an issue downstairs. Lucien set the letter aside immediately. What kind of issue? Hargrove glanced briefly toward Serafina before lowering his voice. Lady Hollowmere has returned. Silence filled the room completely. Serafina felt the atmosphere change at once. The warmth near the fire suddenly seemed thinner somehow. Colder. Lucien did not move for several seconds. Then very slowly he loosened the cuffs at his wrists again with controlled precision. His eyes darkening in a way she had not seen before tonight. I thought she left, Serafina said quietly. So did I, Lucien replied. But something in his voice suggested he already knew exactly why Victoria had come back. Lucien moved before Serafina fully processed the change in him. One moment he stood near the desk beneath the firelight. The next he had crossed half the room with controlled speed that revealed exactly how dangerous restraint could become once sharpened by purpose. Where is she? He asked Hargrove quietly. The older servant kept his voice low. In the south drawing room, Your Grace. Most guests have departed, but several families remain nearby. Lucien nodded once. Did she say why she returned? No, Your Grace. A silence followed. Hargrove glanced briefly toward Serafina again before adding carefully. Lady Hollowmere requested a private audience. Lucien's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Denied. Very good, Your Grace. Ensure the remaining guests leave within the next 15 minutes. Immediately, Hargrove withdrew quickly, leaving the door closed behind him once more. The room fell silent except for the wind outside. Serafina watched Lucien loosen his cufflinks slowly beside the fire. Not nervous movements, deliberate ones. The kind a man used to regain control before entering conflict. You knew she would come back, Serafina said quietly. Lucien did not deny it. I suspected she might. Why? Because Victoria does not surrender influence gracefully. He removed the silver cufflinks entirely and placed them beside the unopened letters on the desk. And because tonight disrupted years of assumptions she benefited from. Serafina crossed slowly toward him. The rumors. Partly. Then there is more. Lucian looked at her directly. There is always more in London. The answer frustrated her instantly. You continue speaking in riddles. I continue preventing damage. To whom? That stopped him. For one brief moment the carefully controlled distance in his expression shifted. Not enough to expose everything. Enough to expose exhaustion. You assume protection feels noble from the inside, he said softly. Often it feels like isolation. Serafina held his gaze quietly. The firelight moved between them in restless gold reflections while snow battered the windows harder outside. Somewhere below, carriage wheels rolled faintly across the frozen courtyard as guests departed Ravensshire House one by one. You still have not answered my question, she said. Which question? Who exactly is Victoria Hollowmere to you? Lucian exhaled slowly through his nose before looking toward the fire. 5 years ago, society assumed we would marry. Serafina felt something tighten unexpectedly low in her chest. Not pain exactly. Awareness. But you did not. No, why? Because Victoria wanted Ravensshire. His voice remained calm. I wanted peace. That sounds almost reasonable. It was not. He crossed toward the sideboard again and poured fresh water into his untouched glass. Victoria does not love people. She studies them, learns where pressure creates fractures. And she could not control you. Lucian's mouth shifted slightly. No one controls me comfortably. The sentence should have sounded arrogant. Somehow it did not. It sounded factual. Serafina studied him quietly. Then why allow the rumors to continue all these years? Lucian drank once from the glass before answering. Because rumors create distance. You said that already. And you still underestimate what distance protects. Before she could press further, another knock interrupted the room. Softer this time. Controlled. Lucian looked toward the door without moving. What is it? Mrs. Whitmore entered carefully. Your Grace. Lady Hollowmere insists upon speaking with the Duchess before departing. The atmosphere in the room changed immediately. Lucian's expression cooled several degrees. No. She claims the matter concerns the dignity of the household. Serafina almost laughed softly at that. How charitable of her. Mrs. Whitmore remained perfectly still. Shall I remove her, Your Grace? Lucian's gaze shifted toward Serafina briefly, measuring, calculating, then back toward the housekeeper. No scene downstairs. Very good, Your Grace. Bring her here. Mrs. Whitmore blinked once. To the private chambers? Yes. The older woman hesitated almost invisibly before bowing her head and withdrawing again. The moment the door closed, Serafina turned sharply toward Lucian. You cannot possibly think this is wise. Wisdom rarely influences Victoria. Then why allow it? Lucian stepped closer slowly. Because she wants an audience. And I prefer my enemies visible. The word settled heavily between them. Enemy. Not former lover. Not wounded woman. Enemy. Serafina searched his expression for hesitation and found none. You truly dislike her. No, his voice lowered slightly. Dislike implies emotion. A strange silence followed. Closer than before somehow. Lucian remained standing near enough now that Serafina became aware of every detail too clearly. The loosened collar at his throat. The faint shadows of fatigue beneath his eyes. The impossible restraint in the way he held himself even while tension sharpened the room around him. You become colder whenever she is mentioned, Serafina observed softly. Lucian's gaze dropped briefly toward her mouth before lifting again immediately. The movement lasted less than a second. She still noticed it. That is because Victoria mistakes attention for permission, he said quietly. And I dislike repeating boundaries. Before Serafina could answer, the door opened again. Lady Victoria Hollowmere entered the room wrapped in snow-dusted black velvet trimmed with silver fur. Her dark hair remained perfectly arranged despite the storm outside. So did her smile. Yet the moment her eyes landed on Serafina standing near Lucian beside the fire, something dangerous flickered briefly beneath that composure. Your Grace, Victoria said smoothly to Lucian. I apologize for the interruption. No, Lucian replied evenly. You do not. The air tightened instantly. Victoria ignored the response and turned gracefully toward Serafina instead. Duchess, I wish to offer congratulations privately before leaving. Serafina met her gaze calmly. You already offered them downstairs. Public congratulations are often performances. Victoria removed her gloves one finger at a time while speaking. Private conversations reveal more interesting truths. Lucien remained completely still beside Serafina. State your purpose, Victoria. Straight to business. How predictable. Her eyes shifted back toward Serafina. I simply worried our new Duchess may not fully understand the family she married into tonight. I understand enough. Do you? Victoria smiled faintly. Ravensshire men have a remarkable talent for silence. It can become rather lonely for the women beside them. Lucien's jaw tightened once. Tiny. Dangerous. Serafina noticed Victoria noticed it too. If this conversation concerns my marriage, Lucien said quietly, it ends now. Your marriage concerns all of London. Not anymore. The room fell silent. Victoria studied him carefully then. For the first time that evening her confidence appeared slightly unstable. Interesting, she murmured softly. You sound protective already. Lucien did not answer. That silence answered enough. Victoria's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly before she turned toward Serafina again. Tell me honestly, Duchess, has His Grace explained why he truly avoided marriage for so long? Serafina remained calm. No. Then perhaps you should ask him about the winter at Blackmere Hall. The sentence landed sharply. Lucien's expression changed instantly. Not anger. Worse. Something colder. Older. Serafina felt it beside her immediately like sudden frost moving through the room. Victoria smiled slowly as though satisfied by the reaction. Good evening, Your Grace. She inclined her head gracefully toward Serafina. Welcome to Ravensshire House. Then she turned and walked toward the door without waiting for dismissal. The moment it closed behind her, silence crashed heavily through the room. Serafina looked toward Lucien at once. He stood completely motionless beside the fire, one hand resting flat against the edge of the mantel so tightly that the muscles in his wrist had gone rigid beneath the skin. What happened at Blackmere Hall? She asked quietly. Lucien did not answer immediately. Outside, wind struck hard against the windows while the last carriage departed the courtyard below. Finally, he looked toward her with eyes darker than before. The reason, he said softly, London stopped trying to arrange marriages for me. Lucien did not move away from the fireplace after speaking. The storm outside had softened slightly, but snow still drifted across the windows in pale silver currents beneath the dark sky. Ravensshire House had finally grown quiet below them. The reception was over. The guests were gone. Yet the silence upstairs felt heavier now than the ballroom ever had. Serafina stood near the center of the room watching him carefully. The firelight carved sharp shadows across his face while one hand remained braced against the marble mantel beside him. Controlled. Still. Dangerous in the way only deeply restrained people could become. What happened at Blackmere Hall? She asked again quietly. Lucien lowered his eyes briefly before answering. An engagement. The word surprised her. You were engaged? Briefly. He finally stepped away from the fireplace and crossed toward the nearest window. Her name was Eleanor Whitford. Serafina remained silent. Something about the way he said the name felt distant rather than emotional. Not grief. Memory. The families arranged it, Lucien continued evenly. Ravensshire required political alliances after my father's death. The Whitfords required stability. Society approved. But the engagement ended. Yes. He looked out into the snow-covered gardens beyond the glass. 3 months before the wedding. Serafina waited. Lucien rarely volunteered information quickly. Every sentence seemed selected with exhausting care before leaving him. Eleanor enjoyed attention, he said quietly. Parties, admirers, public affection. She believed marriage to a duke should resemble theater. And you disliked theater. A faint shift near his mouth acknowledged the truth of it. One winter evening we attended a gathering at Blackmere Hall hosted by her family. There were perhaps 200 guests. His voice remained calm, though Serafina noticed his fingers tighten once against the window frame. During dinner, Eleanor became angry because I refused to dance after midnight. Why? Because I dislike public spectacle. The answer sounded simple. Too simple. That was enough to end an engagement? Lucien looked toward her then. His gray eyes reflected the firelight faintly in the dark room. No, a pause followed. Eleanor decided humiliation would force me to become more accommodating. Serafina felt her stomach tighten slightly. What did she do? Lucien's jaw shifted once before stilling again. She stood in the center of the ballroom and announced that I was incapable of loving women. Silence filled the room. Serafina stared at him quietly while the storm whispered against the windows behind him. The guests laughed, Lucien said softly. Some tried not to. Most failed. Lucien, he continued before she could say more. Eleanor believed public embarrassment would pressure me into proving her wrong somehow. Dancing, flirting, performing interest for society's benefit. His expression remained unreadable. Instead, I ended the engagement immediately and left Blackmere Hall before sunrise. Serafina watched him carefully now. Not the words themselves, the restraint beneath them, the precision. Men unaffected by humiliation did not remember details so clearly years later. And the rumors spread afterward, she said quietly. Yes, you never denied them. No, why? Lucien looked toward the fire again rather than answering immediately. Because for the first time in years, he said softly, people stopped trying to force intimacy into my life. The honesty of the sentence settled painfully through the room. Serafina understood suddenly. The rumors had not merely protected him from gossip. They protected him from expectation, from performance, from being turned into entertainment for aristocratic society again. Eleanor wanted revenge, Lucien continued calmly. Victoria wanted influence. The rumors benefited both of them. And hurt you. His gaze lifted toward hers again. Pain becomes manageable when it is predictable. Serafina felt something inside her chest tighten unexpectedly at that. Not pity. Something deeper and far more dangerous. Understanding. She crossed slowly toward the fire while speaking carefully. You allowed all of London to misunderstand you because distance felt safer than humiliation. Lucien watched her approach without moving. You say that as though it is unreasonable. No, she stopped several feet away from him. I say it because it sounds lonely. The room fell silent again. The fire crackled softly between them while snow continued gathering outside along the stone terraces below. Lucien's expression shifted almost imperceptibly then. Tiny fractures appearing beneath years of discipline. Loneliness, he said quietly, is survivable. That does not make it harmless. Something in him reacted to that. Serafina saw it immediately in the subtle tightening near his eyes before control returned once more. You continue speaking as though you understand isolation very well. I understand invisibility. His gaze sharpened slightly. She continued before hesitation could stop her. You think society ignored me because I lacked beauty or charm. That was never the problem. Lucien remained completely focused on her now. Then what was? I learned too young that people only value women who entertain them. My sisters laughed louder, flirted better, danced beautifully. I preferred silence. Serafina looked briefly toward the fire. Invisible women become useful. Men speak freely around them. Families make decisions without considering them dangerous. And your father? She smiled faintly without warmth. My father remembered I existed whenever debt collectors arrived. Lucien's jaw tightened once at that. Small, controlled, yet unmistakable. He should never have treated you that way. The sentence came low and immediate. Serafina looked at him carefully. You sound angry. I dislike carelessness. That is a very diplomatic word for neglect. Silence followed. Closer now somehow. The distance between them no longer felt entirely safe. Lucien studied her with the same unsettling focus he brought to everything else tonight. But something beneath that focus had changed. Softened slightly. Or perhaps simply become harder to hide. You were wrong about one thing, he said quietly. What? Society did not ignore you because you were invisible. Serafina felt her breath pause briefly. Then why? Lucian held her gaze steadily. Because men often mistake quiet women for harmless ones. The room seemed suddenly smaller after that. Warmer. Serafina became aware of how close he stood near the firelight now. Close enough to notice the faint scent of cedar lingering on his clothes. Close enough to see exhaustion beneath the perfect control in his posture. Neither looked away immediately. A soft knock interrupted the moment. Both turned instantly toward the door. Mrs. Whitmore entered carefully carrying another stack of correspondence tied with black ribbon. Forgive the interruption, Your Grace. These arrived during the reception. Lucian accepted the letters with visible restraint. At this hour? Several were delivered by private messenger. The housekeeper hesitated slightly before adding, one required urgent attention. Lucian examined the top envelope briefly. Serafina noticed the moment his expression cooled again. Leave us, he said quietly. Mrs. Whitmore bowed and withdrew immediately. The door closed behind her. Lucian untied the black ribbon and scanned the first letter quickly. Then another. Silence thickened through the room with every page. Serafina watched the subtle changes in his posture. The tightening near his shoulders. The stillness returning. Finally, he folded one letter closed and placed it carefully onto the desk beside him. What happened? She asked softly. Lucian looked toward her slowly. Someone informed the newspapers that Victoria Hollowmere spent nearly an hour inside my private chambers tonight. Serafina felt cold settle instantly beneath her ribs. That is not true. Truth rarely matters once society smells scandal. He crossed toward the fire again, holding the letter loosely in one hand. By tomorrow morning London will decide exactly what occurred upstairs while my new wife waited downstairs alone. Serafina stared at him. Victoria planned this. Yes. Then stop her. Lucian looked at her for several long seconds. Something darker moved beneath his composure now. Not panic. Calculation. Victoria wants humiliation, he said quietly. Public humiliation specifically. Then do not give it to her. Another silence followed. Then very slowly, Lucian folded the newspaper letter once more and placed it into the fire. Flames curled immediately around the edges. You still do not understand, he murmured softly while watching the paper burn. Scandal only survives when people already believe the man involved capable of it. Serafina felt the meaning settle heavily between them. The rumors, the years of whispers, the carefully cultivated distance. Victoria had not merely spread stories about Lucian. She built an entire society willing to believe the worst version of him immediately. Then perhaps, Serafina said quietly, London needs a different story. Lucian looked toward her sharply. The firelight reflected in his eyes again. Controlled gray suddenly edged with something more dangerous. Interest. What exactly are you suggesting, Duchess? Serafina stepped closer slowly until only a small distance remained between them beside the fire. You said earlier that society watches for cracks. Her voice softened. Then perhaps we should give them something else to watch instead. Lucian did not answer her immediately. The fire snapped softly between them while the last fragments of the burned letter curled into black ash beneath the grate. Snow continued drifting beyond the tall windows in slow silver waves. Ravensshire House had finally fallen almost entirely silent. Only the occasional distant footsteps of servants remained somewhere deep within the corridors below. Serafina stood close enough now to see the exact moment something shifted behind Lucian's controlled expression. Not surprise. Recognition. As though he had expected many things from his arranged bride tonight, but not strategy. You are suggesting we perform happiness for society, he said quietly. I am suggesting we stop allowing other people to write the story for us. Lucian watched her carefully. That requires trust. No, Serafina replied softly. It requires cooperation. Another silence followed. The distinction mattered. They both understood that immediately. Lucian crossed slowly toward the fire, his gaze never fully leaving hers. You speak as though reputation can be managed. Everything in aristocratic society is managed. Serafina moved toward the desk beside the fire and rested her fingers lightly against the polished wood. The people downstairs do not care about truth. They care about patterns, public moments, symbolism. You understand society remarkably well for someone who claims invisibility. Invisible people survive by observing. That nearly drew another smile from him. Nearly. Instead, Lucien looked down briefly at the dying embers in the fireplace before speaking again. And what exactly would this new story look like? Serafina considered him carefully for a moment. The loosened collar at his throat. The exhaustion he tried unsuccessfully to hide now. The dangerous restraint still threaded through every movement he made. Simple, she said quietly. A devoted husband is difficult to scandalize. Lucien's eyes lifted sharply toward hers. Something unreadable moved through them then. Something warmer than before and therefore far more dangerous. You suggest this very calmly. Panic has never improved my thinking. Most women would be furious tonight. Most women were not raised by gamblers. The answer softened something near his expression unexpectedly. Tiny. Brief. Real. Lucien leaned one hand against the edge of the desk beside her. Close enough now that the atmosphere between them shifted again beneath the firelight. You continue surprising me, Duchess. You keep saying that as though it concerns you. It does. His voice lowered slightly. Unexpected things are harder to control. The sentence settled quietly between them. Serafina felt the weight beneath it immediately. Not threat. Honesty. Lucien Ravensheyer spoke like a man who spent his entire life measuring risk before allowing himself attachment to anything. And yet, she murmured softly, you married a stranger. Lucien's gaze dropped briefly toward her gloved hand resting against the desk, toward the wedding ring catching faint gold reflections from the fire. No, he said after a moment. I married a woman society underestimated. Serafina felt her breath catch unexpectedly at that. Before she could answer, a distant clock somewhere in the west wing struck 1 in the morning. The sound echoed faintly through Ravensheyer House like a reminder of how late the hour had become. Lucien straightened slowly from the desk. You should rest. You already said that once tonight. And you ignored me once tonight. His tone remained calm, almost dry. Serafina realized suddenly that this might be the closest thing to humor Lucien Ravensheyer allowed himself publicly. The thought startled her more than it should have. Very well, she said softly. Where exactly does the Duchess of Ravensheyer sleep? The question changed the atmosphere instantly. Tiny. Immediate. Lucien's expression stilled almost imperceptibly. Serafina noticed it because she had begun noticing everything about him now. The pauses. The control. The careful distance he maintained whenever emotion threatened to surface too clearly. Your rooms connect to mine through the east corridor, he replied evenly. Separate chambers were prepared. Serafina held his gaze quietly. You arranged separate rooms before the wedding. Yes. You were very certain I would prefer distance. Lucien did not answer immediately. Most women would. Because of the rumors? Because of me. The honesty of the answer unsettled her again. Not arrogance. Resignation. As though he truly expected discomfort from anyone standing too close to him for too long. Serafina looked toward the fire briefly before speaking carefully. And what do you prefer? Lucien went still beside her. Completely still. That is not a safe question. You keep saying things like that. Because you keep asking dangerous things calmly. Silence stretched between them once more. The storm outside had weakened now into softer snowfall drifting quietly across the dark gardens below. Somewhere deeper inside the house, servants extinguished lamps one by one along the lower corridors. Ravensheyer House was settling into sleep around them. Yet neither moved toward the door. When Eleanor humiliated you at Blackmere, Serafina asked quietly, what frightened you most? Lucien looked away first, toward the fire. Toward the dying embers. Not humiliation. Then what? Pause followed. Long enough that she wondered if he would answer at all. The realization, he said softly, that people will destroy intimacy the moment it becomes visible. The sentence landed with painful clarity between them. Serafina understood then why he guarded himself so fiercely, why distance became safety, why rumors felt easier than vulnerability. Society had turned his private life into theater once before. He never intended to survive that experience twice. "You think closeness always becomes weakness," she said gently. Lucien's jaw tightened faintly. "Does history suggest otherwise?" Before she could respond, a sudden gust of wind rattled the windows sharply. The fire flickered lower. Instinctively, Serafina reached toward the nearby candle beside the desk before it toppled from the draft. At the exact same moment, Lucien reached for it too. Their hands collided lightly in the dim firelight. Everything stopped. The contact lasted barely a second. Glove against skin. Warmth against restraint. Yet Serafina felt the reaction move through him immediately. Lucien's fingers closed reflexively around hers before releasing just as quickly. Too quickly. His breathing changed once. Tiny. Controlled. But not fast enough to escape her notice. Neither spoke. The candle flame steadied between them while outside snow drifted silently through the darkness. Serafina slowly lifted her eyes toward his face. Lucien was already watching her. Not cold now. Not distant. Worse. Focused. Like every layer of discipline holding him together had narrowed entirely toward the woman standing inches away from him beside the fire. "Lucien," she said softly. His name sounded unfamiliar in the room somehow. Personal. Dangerous. His jaw tightened once at the sound of it. "You should not say my name like that." "Like what?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, his gaze moved slowly across her face with a level of attention so intense it almost felt physical. Serafina felt heat rise beneath her skin despite the winter storm outside. Lucien stepped back first. Barely. But enough to restore distance before it disappeared entirely. "You asked earlier what I feared," he said quietly. "This is the answer." Serafina stared at him. "Standing too close to your wife?" A faint, almost laugh escaped him then. Low. Short. Entirely without humor. No, his eyes held hers steadily now. "Forgetting how to remain controlled once I do." Neither of them moved immediately after that confession. The fire had burned lower now, casting softer shadows across the walls of Lucien's private chambers, while the storm outside faded into slow drifting snow beneath the dark London sky. Ravensshire House felt suspended in silence around them. No music, no ballroom laughter, only the faint ticking of the clock near the bookshelf and the careful sound of two people standing too close to honesty. Serafina watched him quietly. Lucien had spent the entire evening controlling every room he entered with precision so absolute it bordered on frightening. Yet now, standing beside the fire with his collar loosened and restraint visibly tightening across every line of his body, he looked less untouchable than dangerously human. "You speak about control as though it is survival," she said softly. Lucien's gaze remained fixed on her. "For some people, it is. And what happens when it fails?" A faint shadow crossed his expression. "People get hurt." The answer came too quickly, too personally. Serafina studied him carefully. "Someone hurt you before. That is not unusual." "No," her voice lowered slightly. "But fear like yours rarely comes from embarrassment alone." Silence settled again. Lucien turned away first this time, crossing slowly toward the window overlooking the snow-covered gardens. He rested one hand lightly against the dark frame while staring into the night beyond the glass. "You ask difficult questions for a woman who met me 12 hours ago. You answer them anyway." A brief pause followed. "Sometimes." Serafina moved toward the fire again, more for warmth than distance. The velvet cloak Lucien arranged for her earlier still rested folded carefully across the nearby chair. She touched the fabric absently while watching his reflection faintly in the dark window. "When you left Blackmere Hall?" she asked quietly. "Did you care about Eleanor?" Lucien did not respond immediately. "I respected her once." "That is not the same thing." No, his reflection shifted slightly as he turned back toward the room. "But I believed respect could become enough." Serafina understood that answer more than she wished to admit. Aristocratic marriages rarely began with affection. They began with strategy, expectation, survival. People like Lucien were raised to believe emotion complicated duty. Yet standing here tonight, watching the careful restraint in every movement he made around her, she suddenly doubted he had ever truly been capable of loving halfway. And now? She asked before caution stopped her. Do you still believe respect is enough? Lucien looked directly at her. The silence stretched long enough that she felt the weight of the question fully settle between them. Then very quietly he said, "No." The honesty of it moved through the room like another kind of storm entirely. Serafina felt her pulse shift unexpectedly beneath her skin. Lucien crossed back toward the fireplace slowly afterward, though he kept several feet of distance between them this time. Deliberate distance. Necessary distance. "You should sleep," he said again. His voice sounded rougher now. More controlled because it needed to be. Serafina almost smiled faintly. "You are repeating yourself. You are still ignoring me. Perhaps I enjoy making the Duke uncomfortable." Another almost smile touched his mouth briefly before disappearing. "You are succeeding remarkably well." The admission should have sounded teasing. Instead it sounded dangerously true. Before either could say more, a soft sound echoed faintly through the corridor outside. Footsteps. Then another quieter knock against the chamber door. Lucien's expression cooled immediately, though Serafina now recognized the transition more clearly. The distance he wore around others was armor. "Enter," he said calmly. Hargrove stepped inside carrying a silver tray with fresh candles and another sealed envelope resting atop folded cream paper. The older servant approached carefully, though his eyes flickered once between Lucien and Serafina with subtle awareness. "Forgive the interruption, Your Grace. This arrived moments ago by private courier." Lucien accepted the envelope without comment. The seal bore no family crest, only a dark wax impression pressed flat and unmarked. Serafina noticed the slight tightening near Lucien's jaw the moment he saw it. "Will there be anything further tonight?" Hargrove asked quietly. "No." The servant bowed and withdrew silently once more. Lucien remained standing near the fire staring at the envelope in his hand for several seconds after the door closed. "Another scandal?" Serafina asked carefully. "No." He broke the seal slowly. "Something worse." The room fell quiet again except for the crackle of burning wood. Serafina watched his eyes move across the letter line by line. Whatever he read altered something subtle in his posture almost immediately. Not fear. Alertness. "What is it?" Lucien folded the letter once. "Someone has been investigating Ravensshire accounts. Financial accounts? Estate records. Political transactions. Land transfers." Serafina frowned slightly. "Why would that matter?" Lucien looked toward her carefully. "Because half the aristocracy in England depends upon Ravensshire influence remaining stable. And someone wants instability." "Yes." He crossed toward the desk and placed the letter beside the others before continuing quietly. "Victoria enjoys social warfare. This is different." Serafina felt the atmosphere sharpen around the room once more. "Who sent the letter?" "An old contact in Parliament." "Someone you trust?" Lucien's expression shifted faintly at the word trust. "As much as possible." Serafina moved closer slowly. "What exactly are they investigating?" Lucien hesitated. "My father." That surprised her. "The former Duke?" "Several land acquisitions made shortly before his death." His voice remained even, though tension threaded quietly beneath it now. "There were rumors at the time regarding corruption, bribery, political favors. Were the rumors true?" Lucien held her gaze steadily. "I do not know." The answer startled her because it sounded genuine. "You inherited Ravensshire without knowing whether your father committed crimes?" "I inherited Ravensshire at 21 years old, surrounded by debt, political enemies, and men waiting for me to fail." His voice lowered slightly. "There was little time for grief, less time for investigation." Serafina looked at him carefully then. The impossible expectations, the years of distance, the relentless control. For the first time she fully understood that Lucien Ravensshire had not become emotionally guarded by accident. He had been shaped by responsibility until vulnerability itself began to resemble recklessness. "You have been alone in this a very long time," she said softly. Lucian looked away immediately. That reaction alone answered enough. Alone is efficient, he replied quietly. Alone is exhausting. Silence followed. Heavy. Intimate in a way neither fully acknowledged aloud. Lucian leaned one hand against the edge of the desk while staring down at the scattered letters there. The firelight moved softly across the dark wood and silver ink seals. Serafina became aware suddenly that this room contained more truth than the entire ballroom downstairs ever had. No performances remained here now. Only exhaustion, restraint, and something else neither of them seemed prepared to name yet. What happens if the investigation becomes public? She asked. Lucian's mouth tightened faintly. The newspapers will connect it to tonight's scandal immediately. Raven's higher reputation collapses. Political allies disappear. Parliament distances itself. And Victoria? Benefits. Serafina crossed slowly toward him until she stood near enough to see the exact lines of fatigue beneath his eyes again. Then she is not merely protecting gossip, she said quietly. She is destabilizing you deliberately. Lucian looked at her for a long moment before answering. Yes. Why? Another silence. Then finally, because I stopped giving her access to Raven's hire years ago. Serafina absorbed that quietly. So she wants revenge. No, his gaze darkened slightly. Victoria wants control returned. The room seemed colder after that. Outside, the snowfall had nearly stopped entirely now. Pale moonlight reflected softly across the frozen gardens beyond the windows. Lucian straightened slowly from the desk and looked toward the adjoining eastern doorway leading deeper into the private suite. It is late, he said quietly. You need rest. Serafina studied him carefully. And you? I need several hours without interruption. Meaning work. Meaning distance. The honesty of it should have stung more than it did. Instead, it felt strangely understandable. Lucian Ravenshire retreated into control whenever pressure tightened around him. Work, silence, isolation. That was how he survived. Very well, she said softly at last. Then I suppose this is good night, Your Grace. Lucian's eyes lifted toward hers immediately at the formal title. Something unreadable flickered briefly across his expression before disappearing again. Serafina. The sound of her name in his voice felt quieter than the fire itself. She paused near the doorway. Yes. Lucian seemed about to say something else. The tension appeared visibly in the slight tightening of his jaw, the measured control in his breathing. Then finally he only said, Lock the connecting door between our rooms tonight. Confusion crossed her face instantly. Why? His gaze held hers steadily across the fire-lit room. Because if London intends war against Ravensshire, he said softly, I would prefer you safe while I determine who else is involved. Serafina stared at him for several long seconds afterward. Not because of the warning itself. Because beneath all the cold control and dangerous restraint, Lucian's first instinct had become protecting her without hesitation. And somehow that frightened her far more than the rumors ever had. Serafina did not lock the connecting door. She stood inside her new chambers long after Lucian's footsteps faded deeper into the adjoining suite, staring at the polished brass handle between their rooms while candlelight flickered softly across the walls around her. The Duchess of Ravenshire's chambers were larger than the entire second floor of her father's estate. Pale ivory walls trimmed in gold leaf. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the eastern gardens. A marble fireplace still burning low against the winter cold. Everything elegant. Everything prepared carefully in advance for a wife Lucian supposedly never intended to let close. That contradiction unsettled her more than the rumors themselves ever had. A maid had already arranged her nightclothes beside the dressing screen before quietly disappearing hours earlier. Yet Serafina remained standing near the center of the room, still wearing the wedding diamonds at her throat. Her reflection stared back at her from the tall mirror beside the fireplace. White silk, pale skin, silver embroidery catching the candlelight. She looked exactly like the kind of Duchess London expected. Composed, decorative, untouchable. The thought almost made her laugh. Somewhere beyond the connecting door, Lucian remained awake. She could feel it somehow. Not hear him exactly. Sense him. The awareness lingered beneath her skin in a way that felt increasingly dangerous. Serafina crossed slowly toward the window overlooking the snow-covered gardens below. Ravensheir House stood silent now beneath the fading storm. Moonlight reflected across the frozen fountains and black iron gates, while distant lanterns burned softly near the carriage house. Peaceful from the outside. Yet beneath that polished silence, she could feel tension tightening around the estate already. Political investigations. Public scandal. Victoria Hollowmere circling Ravensheir like a patient predator. And at the center of it all stood Lucian, exhausting himself trying to maintain control over forces that had clearly been pressing against him for years. A soft sound interrupted her thoughts. Not from the corridor. From the adjoining room. The connecting door between their chambers remained slightly open. Only an inch perhaps. Enough for faint firelight from Lucian's study to spill quietly across the carpet. Serafina stared at it for several seconds. Then, before caution could interfere, she crossed the room slowly and pushed the door open farther. Lucian stood near the bookshelf inside his private study with his back partially turned toward her. He had removed the black waistcoat sometime during the past hour, leaving only the white dress shirt beneath. The sleeves were rolled carefully to his forearms while several open ledgers and letters covered the desk beside him. He looked up instantly the moment the door moved. Not startled. Alert. "You did not lock it," he said quietly. Serafina leaned lightly against the doorway. "Neither did you." Silence followed. Lucian watched her for a moment before setting another letter aside. "It is nearly 3 in the morning. You are still working." "Yes." That was not an answer. A faint shadow of restrained amusement crossed his face again. "You appear unable to sleep. You appear unable to stop controlling everything." That nearly earned her another smile. Nearly. Lucian crossed toward the sideboard near the fire and poured fresh water into a crystal glass before offering it toward her silently. Serafina accepted it this time without argument. "What are you looking for?" she asked softly. "Patterns." He returned toward the desk. "Financial inconsistencies. Land transfers connected to my father's old parliamentary allies. And someone has been moving Ravensheir funds quietly through shell accounts for years." Serafina frowned slightly. "Without your knowledge? I inherited a damaged estate at 21. There were hundreds of accounts." His voice remained calm though exhaustion edged more visibly beneath it now. "I trusted the wrong advisors." "Victoria." Lucian's jaw tightened faintly. "Indirectly." Serafina moved farther inside the study. The room smelled faintly of cedar smoke, ink, and winter air drifting through the slightly open balcony doors beyond the curtains. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling while firelight reflected softly across dark polished wood. Everything about the room felt intensely masculine and painfully lonely at the same time. "You have been handling this alone for years," she said quietly. Lucian did not look up from the ledger in his hands. "That is generally how responsibility works." "No, that is how isolation works." The sentence settled between them. He finally looked toward her then. Tired gray eyes. Perfect control stretched thinner now beneath the late hour and endless pressure surrounding him. "You are very determined to understand me. You are my husband." The words changed something in the room instantly. Tiny. Dangerous. Lucian held her gaze steadily for several long seconds afterward. Then very softly he asked, "And what exactly does that mean to you?" Serafina felt her breath catch unexpectedly. Because beneath the question lay something far more personal than duty. Lucian wanted to know whether she intended distance too. Whether this marriage would become another arrangement built entirely from silence. "I do not know yet," she admitted honestly. "But I think marriage should feel less lonely than whatever you have survived until now." Lucian looked away first. The reaction alone told her enough. He crossed toward the fire slowly and rested one hand against the mantel while staring down into the flames. "Loneliness becomes easier after enough time," he murmured. "No," Serafina said softly from behind him. "People only say that after they stop believing anything better exists." The room fell silent again. Lucian's shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly beneath the white shirt before relaxing once more. You should stop speaking so honestly after midnight, he said quietly. Why? Because exhaustion lowers defenses. Serafina studied him carefully. And yours are lowering now? He gave a short breath that almost resembled laughter. Almost. Dangerously. She should have returned to her room then. Any sensible duchess would have. Instead she crossed slowly toward the fire until only a small distance remained between them again. Close enough now to notice the faint shadows beneath his eyes. Close enough to see how tired he truly looked beneath the endless discipline holding him together. Lucien. He looked down toward her immediately at the sound of his name. That reaction had become impossible to miss now. Controlled men always revealed themselves through what affected their control. What? His voice sounded lower than before, rougher around the edges. Serafina hesitated only briefly. Then she lifted one hand slowly toward the loose cuff at his forearm, where the sleeve had partially fallen open while he worked. You are bleeding. Lucien looked down instantly. A thin line of blood marked the side of his wrist where broken sealing wax from one of the letters must have cut against his skin unnoticed earlier. The injury was small, barely more than a scratch. Yet Serafina saw the exact moment he realized she had touched him before he reacted to the wound itself. Her fingers remained lightly against his wrist for only a second longer before she began withdrawing. Lucien's hand closed gently around hers before she could fully pull away. Everything stopped. The fire crackled softly beside them. Snow drifted beyond the windows. Somewhere deep within Ravenshire's house, a distant clock marked the passing hour. Yet inside the study, silence tightened around the single point where his hand held hers. Lucien's breathing changed first. Tiny, controlled, but unmistakable now. His gaze remained fixed on her face with an intensity that felt almost unbearable in the quiet room. Serafina felt heat rise beneath her skin instantly. Not fear. Awareness. You should let go, she whispered softly. Lucien's fingers tightened once before loosening again. Probably. But he did not release her immediately. Instead his eyes moved slowly across her face as though memorizing details against his own better judgment. Serafina became suddenly conscious of everything at once. The warmth of his hand around hers. The loosened collar at his throat. The impossible restraint visibly fraying beneath the surface every time she stood too close. This is what you meant earlier, she said quietly. About losing control. Lucien finally released her hand then. Immediately. Abruptly enough that the absence of contact felt strangely sharp afterward. He stepped back toward the fire at once, restoring distance through visible force of will. You should return to your room, he said softly. Now. Serafina stared at him. You sound frightened again. I am. The honesty of the answer stunned her into silence. Lucien looked toward the fire instead of her now, jaw tight with restraint. You think the rumors about me were cruel because they questioned my interest in women. His voice lowered further. They were cruel because they allowed people to mistake restraint for absence. Serafina felt her pulse shift instantly. Lucien continued before she could answer. Distance was manageable. Desire is not. The room seemed suddenly far too small, too warm, too intimate. Serafina took a slow breath. You speak as though wanting someone is dangerous. Lucien looked at her again then, fully, completely, every layer of control tightening visibly around something far more intense beneath it. For men like me, he said quietly, it can become catastrophic. Serafina should have left after that. Any rational woman standing inside the private study of a man visibly unraveling beneath restraint would have stepped back immediately and closed the distance between them forever. Instead she remained exactly where she was beside the fire, watching Lucien with a level of attention that felt increasingly irreversible. He stood several feet away now, one hand braced against the edge of the mantel as though physical stillness remained the only thing preventing something far more dangerous from surfacing. The white shirt stretched tightly across his shoulders beneath the firelight. His sleeves remained rolled to his forearms. Controlled. Precise. Yet nothing about him looked calm anymore. Catastrophic, Serafina repeated softly. That sounds dramatic. A faint, humorless breath escaped him. You have no idea. Silence followed. The fire crackled low between them while the first traces of dawn remained hours away beyond the snow-covered gardens outside. Ravensshire House slept around them in deep winter quiet. Yet inside the study, tension had become almost tangible. "You continue speaking as though desire destroys people," Serafina said carefully. Lucian's eyes lifted toward hers immediately. "Unchecked desire does. And yours is unchecked?" Another dangerous silence. Then very quietly he answered, "Not yet." The honesty of the response moved through her like heat. Lucian looked away almost instantly afterward, jaw tightening as though he regretted speaking at all. Serafina crossed slowly toward the bookshelf beside the fire instead, allowing him distance without retreating entirely. Her fingers brushed lightly across the leather spines arranged in perfect order along the shelves. History, political theory, military strategy, poetry hidden between them almost invisibly. She noticed that too. "You hide novels among parliamentary records," she observed softly. "That seems suspicious. People search less carefully when they believe a room belongs to a cold man." Serafina glanced toward him over her shoulder. "And does it?" Another pause. No, the answer arrived quieter than before, more tired somehow. She pulled one of the books partially from the shelf before stopping suddenly. A folded paper slipped from between the pages and landed softly onto the carpet near her feet. Lucian moved instantly. Too instantly. He crossed the room in barely 2 strides and bent toward the paper at the exact same moment Serafina reached for it. Their hands collided again. This time Lucian froze completely. Serafina looked down. The paper was not political correspondence. It was a charcoal sketch. Her sketch. She stared at the drawing in stunned silence while Lucian slowly released the edge of the paper. The sketch showed her standing beside the cathedral steps earlier that evening before the wedding ceremony began. The veil. The winter wind catching the edge of her cloak. The expression on her face captured with impossible accuracy. Not decorative. Not fragile. Watching the crowd with calm restraint while everyone underestimated her. Serafina looked up slowly. "You drew this?" Lucian remained very still beside her. "Yes." "When?" "Before the ceremony." Confusion flickered across her face immediately. "How?" "I arrived early." His voice stayed controlled, though tension threaded visibly beneath every word now. "You stood outside the cathedral for several minutes before entering." Serafina stared at the sketch again. "You were watching me?" "Yes." "Why?" Lucian's jaw tightened faintly. "Because everyone else was looking at the scandal." His eyes held hers steadily now. "I was looking at you." The room seemed to narrow around them instantly. Serafina felt her pulse shift hard beneath her skin. "You drew me before we even spoke. I noticed you long before tonight." That stunned her completely. "What?" Lucian looked away briefly toward the fire before continuing. "Your father brought you to Parliament receptions twice last season." Serafina searched her memory. "I barely attended those." "I know." "Then how do you remember?" A flicker crossed his expression. Something dangerously close to vulnerability. "Because you spent the entire evening standing beside the eastern balcony, pretending not to notice people ignoring you." Her breath caught softly. Lucian continued before she could recover. "Most women in those rooms fought desperately to remain visible. You looked relieved every time attention moved elsewhere." Serafina could not speak for several seconds. The realization settled slowly through her chest with disorienting force. While London spread rumors about the cold Duke incapable of desire, Lucian had been quietly observing her long before their marriage existed. Watching, remembering, noticing details no one else considered important. "You knew who I was," she whispered. "Yes." "Then this marriage was not entirely political." Lucian's silence answered first. Then finally he said, "No." The fire cracked sharply beside them. Neither moved away from the other. Serafina still held the sketch carefully between her fingers while Lucian stood close enough now that she could hear the slight change in his breathing again. Not uncontrolled. Worse, controlled too tightly. "Why me?" she asked softly. Lucian looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Because you were the first person in years who looked untouched by performance." The honesty of it struck deeper than she expected. Serafina lowered her eyes briefly toward the sketch in her hands. The careful lines, the impossible attention to detail. No man had ever studied her closely enough to draw her expression from memory. "This is not how indifferent men behave," she murmured quietly. Lucien's gaze darkened slightly. "I never claimed indifference." "No," she looked back up at him slowly. "You allowed everyone else to claim it for you." Another silence settled between them, heavy now, intimate in a way neither could undo anymore. Lucien reached toward the sketch at last, his fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the paper near hers. The contact remained painfully brief. Still she felt it immediately. So did he. "I should not have kept this," he said quietly. "Why?" His eyes held hers. "Because it reveals too much." Serafina understood suddenly why Lucien feared desire more than gossip. Rumors could be survived. Vulnerability could not. Not for men raised inside ruthless aristocratic systems where every weakness eventually became public entertainment. Yet despite all his restraint, despite years spent constructing distance around himself, he had drawn her before they even married. Carefully, quietly, like a man already fighting attachment long before he admitted it existed. "Lucien." Her voice softened around his name again. His expression shifted instantly at the sound. Tiny fractures appearing beneath the discipline. "You should stop doing that." "Doing what?" "Saying my name like you trust me." The answer hurt unexpectedly. Serafina looked at him carefully. "I think you want trust very badly for someone who fears it this much." Lucien stared at her for several long seconds afterward. Then slowly, almost against his own instincts, he lifted one hand toward her face. He stopped before touching her. Barely an inch remained between his fingers and her skin. The restraint in that single halted movement felt more intimate than contact itself. Serafina felt her breathing slow instinctively. Lucien looked at her like a man standing at the edge of something irreversible. "You do not understand what you are doing to me," he said quietly. Before she could answer, rapid footsteps echoed suddenly through the outer corridor. Both turned instantly toward the door. A second later someone knocked sharply against the study entrance. Not polite. Urgent. Lucien lowered his hand immediately and stepped back, every trace of vulnerability vanishing beneath cold composure with frightening speed. "Enter." Hargrove appeared in the doorway, visibly pale beneath the corridor candlelight. "Your Grace." Lucien's expression hardened instantly. "What happened?" The old servant swallowed carefully. "There has been an incident downstairs." Silence tightened through the room. "Explain." Hargrove hesitated only briefly. "Someone broke into the West Archive room approximately 20 minutes ago." Lucien went completely still. "Was anything taken?" "No, Your Grace. But several Ravensshire financial records were searched." Serafina felt cold settle instantly beneath her ribs. Lucien's voice lowered dangerously. "Who discovered this?" "Mrs. Whitmore. She found the archive door open while checking the lower corridors." Lucien crossed toward the desk immediately, all warmth erased now beneath ruthless focus. "Lock down the estate." "Already done, Your Grace." "No servants leave until sunrise." "Yes, Your Grace." Hargrove hesitated again before adding quietly, "There is one more thing." Lucien looked up sharply. "What?" "Mrs. Whitmore found this near the archive entrance." The servant stepped forward and placed a single silver cufflink onto the desk beneath the firelight. Serafina recognized it instantly. So did Lucien. Victoria Hollomere's family crest gleamed coldly from the polished silver surface. The silver cufflink rested beneath the firelight like a declaration of war. Serafina stared at the Hollomere crest engraved into the polished surface while silence tightened through Lucien's study with almost unbearable force. Lucien did not touch the cufflink immediately. He simply looked at it with the same terrifying stillness she had begun associating with the moments he became most dangerous. "No one leaves the estate," he said quietly to Hargrove. "Not servants. Not guests. No one." "Yes, Your Grace." "Double security near the West Archives." "Already done." Lucien nodded once. "Tell Mrs. Whitmore I want every staff member questioned before sunrise." Hargrove hesitated briefly. And Lady Hollowmere? The room seemed to cool several degrees at the mention of her name. Lucian finally picked up the cufflink slowly between two fingers. Victoria left Ravensshire House nearly 4 hours ago. You believe someone planted it? Serafina asked carefully. Lucian looked toward her. Victoria is manipulative, not careless. He turned the cufflink once beneath the light. This was meant to be found. Hargrove remained near the doorway awaiting further instruction. Lucian's expression hardened slightly. Send for my carriage at dawn. You intend to visit Hollowmere House personally? Yes. The old servant bowed once and withdrew silently from the study. The moment the door closed, quiet settled heavily around the room again. Lucian placed the cufflink onto the desk with precise control before moving toward the window overlooking the eastern gardens. Dawn still lingered far beyond the horizon, but the snowfall had stopped entirely now. Pale moonlight reflected across frozen stone paths and dark iron gates below. Serafina watched him carefully from beside the fire. You think Victoria wants you angry, she said softly. She wants distraction. From the financial investigation. Yes. Lucian rested one hand against the cold glass. Someone is searching Ravensshire records deliberately. Victoria benefits from confusion surrounding my reputation. But this... He glanced briefly toward the desk behind him. This is strategic. Serafina crossed slowly toward the bookshelf again. Still holding the charcoal sketch he forgot to take back from her earlier. Strange how quickly the room had changed. Only minutes ago the atmosphere between them felt dangerously intimate. Now tension moved through the study in colder waves. Political. Calculated. Yet beneath it all, the awareness between them remained impossible to ignore. Who else had access to the archives? She asked. Lucian turned toward her. Very few people. Then the intruder understood Ravensshire House well. Yes. Silence followed briefly. Then Serafina spoke more carefully. Including the private corridors. Lucian's expression shifted slightly. Explain. The West Archives are not near the ballroom. She looked toward him steadily. Whoever entered the estate tonight knew exactly where to go without attracting attention. Lucian studied her for several seconds afterward. Not dismissing her. Evaluating. You notice inconvenient details too quickly. Invisible women survive by listening. Another quiet pause. Then Lucian crossed slowly back toward the desk and opened one of the financial ledgers spread across the dark wood. Come here. The command arrived low and controlled. Not harsh. Worse. Instinctive. Serafina felt heat move unexpectedly through her chest before she stepped closer beside him. Lucian rested one hand against the open ledger, while pointing towards several marked transactions written in faded black ink. These transfers occurred approximately 6 years ago, shortly after my father's death. Serafina leaned slightly closer to read the numbers. The scent of cedar and smoke surrounding him felt distracting at this distance. The accounts move through 3 estates before disappearing entirely, she observed quietly. Lucian looked toward her sharply. You understand financial routing? My father lost fortunes often enough that I learned to read debt records before 16. A faint shadow crossed Lucian's expression. That should never have been necessary. No, she agreed softly. But it was useful. Their shoulders nearly touched now as they studied the ledger together beneath the firelight. Lucian remained very still beside her. Too still. Serafina had begun recognizing that particular kind of stillness. The kind born from concentration sharpened by restraint. The missing funds connect directly to Blackmere Holdings, she murmured after another moment. Lucian's gaze shifted immediately toward her. What did you say? Serafina pointed toward a line buried halfway through the ledger page. Here. Blackmere Trading Company. Silence crashed through the room instantly. Lucian stared at the entry for several long seconds without speaking. Then very quietly he said, That company belonged to Eleanor Whitford's father. Serafina felt cold settle beneath her ribs. The same family from Blackmere Hall. Yes. Lucian straightened slowly from the desk. Every trace of warmth vanished from his expression again beneath cold realization. Victoria knew Eleanor extremely well. Then this began years ago. Lucian looked toward the fire with dangerous focus. Before my engagement ended, the implications spread quietly between them. Not random rumors, not isolated humiliation, something coordinated, built slowly over years around Lucian's reputation, his political influence, and Ravensshire itself. Serafina looked down again at the financial records covering the desk. They wanted you isolated. Lucian's eyes lifted toward hers immediately. What? Think about it. She stepped closer to the ledgers again. If society believed you incapable of intimacy, you would avoid marriage. Without marriage, there would be no Duchess, no heir, no alliance strong enough to challenge anyone managing Ravensshire finances from inside. Lucian went completely still. Isolation creates vulnerability, she continued softly, especially for powerful men. Silence followed. Then very quietly Lucian said, "You believe the rumors were cultivated intentionally to keep Ravensshire politically exposed. I believe lonely men are easier to manipulate." His gaze remained fixed on her now with startling intensity. Not because she frightened him, because she understood him. The realization seemed to unsettle him more deeply than disagreement ever could. All these years, he murmured quietly, almost to himself, I believed distance protected the estate. Serafina held his gaze steadily. Perhaps it protected the wrong people instead. The fire snapped sharply in the grate beside them. Lucian looked away first. He crossed toward the sideboard and poured whiskey into a crystal glass with measured control before stopping halfway through the motion. His hand tightened once around the decanter. Then he set it down untouched. You do not drink, Serafina observed. Rarely. Because you dislike losing control. A faint humorless smile touched his mouth briefly. You make that sound pathological. No, her voice softened. I make it sound exhausting. Lucian looked at her again after that. Really looked at her. The study fell quiet around them while dawn remained far beyond the frozen windows outside. Serafina still held the charcoal sketch carefully against her fingers. The image he drew of her before the wedding. Before any of this. Before she understood that Lucian Ravensshire had never been emotionally detached at all. Only terrified of where attachment might lead. Why did you truly marry me? She asked softly. Lucian's breathing slowed almost imperceptibly. You already know the political reasons. I asked for the truth. Another silence. Heavy now. Intimate despite the cold tension surrounding the investigation. Lucian crossed slowly toward her until only a small distance remained between them beside the desk. Because, he said quietly, you looked at me during the ceremony without pity. Serafina felt her chest tighten unexpectedly. Lucian continued before she could answer. Every person in that cathedral believed they understood me already. You did not. His eyes moved briefly toward the sketch still resting in her hands. And I realized very suddenly that I wanted to know what it would feel like if someone saw me clearly instead. The honesty of the confession stole the air from the room. Serafina looked down briefly because holding his gaze suddenly felt dangerous. Lucian, do not. His voice lowered further. Not unless you intend to keep doing this to me. She looked back up slowly. Doing what? He stared at her for several long seconds before answering. Making restraint feel impossible. The atmosphere between them tightened instantly again. Serafina became aware of every inch separating them beside the desk. The warmth of the fire, the exhaustion in his eyes, the terrifying control visibly fraying every time honesty entered the room between them. Then suddenly another sound echoed through the corridor outside. Faster this time. Urgent footsteps approaching the study again. Both turned immediately toward the door just before Mrs. Whitmore entered without waiting for permission. The older housekeeper looked pale beneath the candlelight. Your Grace. Lucian's expression cooled instantly. What happened now? Mrs. Whitmore swallowed carefully. A messenger arrived from the morning papers. Silence sharpened through the room. And? Lucian asked quietly. Mrs. Whitmore hesitated only briefly before speaking. The newspapers are printing a story at sunrise claiming the Duchess spent her wedding night alone because the Duke could not bear sharing her chambers. The room went silent enough for Serafina to hear the faint hiss of burning wood inside the fireplace. Mrs. Whitmore remained standing near the study entrance, holding the folded newspaper draft in trembling hands, while Lucien stood motionless beside the desk. Not shocked. Not angry. Worse than either. Controlled. Serafina had learned enough about him now to recognize the danger in that stillness immediately. Who authorized the story? Lucien asked quietly. Mrs. Whitmore lowered her eyes. The editor refused to reveal his source, Your Grace. But the messenger implied the information came from someone inside the reception. Of course it did, Serafina murmured softly. Lucien extended one hand toward the folded paper. Mrs. Whitmore crossed quickly through the room and placed it into his grasp before retreating again. The firelight reflected sharply across the black print while Lucien read the first lines in silence. Serafina watched the slight tightening near his jaw, the only visible sign that the words affected him at all. Finally, he folded the paper closed once more. Leave us, he said calmly. Mrs. Whitmore hesitated briefly. Your Grace, the article is scheduled for distribution within the hour. I am aware. Should I send word to the publisher? No, his voice lowered slightly. Prepare the ballroom instead. Confusion flickered across the older woman's face. The ballroom? Lucien's eyes lifted slowly toward Serafina. Yes. Silence passed between husband and wife for one brief, charged moment before understanding settled quietly into her chest. Lucien was done retreating. Mrs. Whitmore seemed to recognize it too. She bowed immediately and withdrew without another question. The moment the door closed, Serafina looked toward him carefully. What are you planning? Lucien placed the folded newspaper beside the financial ledgers with precise control. You were correct earlier. About what? Society needs a different story. He crossed toward the windows overlooking the eastern gardens. Dawn had finally begun softening the horizon beyond the estate walls into pale winter gray. Victoria spent years building a version of me London found useful. His reflection shifted faintly against the glass. Cold, detached, safe to ridicule because distance looked indistinguishable from weakness. Serafina stepped closer slowly. And now, Lucien turned toward her fully. Every layer of restraint remained visible. Yet something beneath it had changed during the long hours of the night. Hardened, clarified. Now, he said quietly, I intend to become inconvenient. The words settled through her with startling force. Serafina realized suddenly that Lucien was not merely protecting his reputation anymore. He was protecting her too. The newspapers had crossed a line by humiliating his wife publicly on the first morning of their marriage. And Lucien Ravensheyer clearly did not forgive humiliation easily. The ballroom, she said softly. You intend to confront them publicly. Yes. At sunrise. Before the newspapers spread. Lucien moved toward the desk again and began gathering several documents together into one leather portfolio. Most of the remaining guests never left Ravensheyer House because of the storm. Half of London society is still sleeping under my roof. Including people already repeating the rumors. Exactly. Serafina watched him quietly, calm, precise, ruthlessly composed again now that purpose replaced uncertainty. Yet beneath the control she sensed something more dangerous still. Determination sharpened by emotion, he no longer seemed willing to hide completely. Lucien. He looked up immediately at the sound of his name. If you do this, she said carefully, there is no returning to distance afterward. A long silence followed. Then very quietly he answered, I know. The honesty of it tightened something unexpectedly inside her chest. Lucien crossed slowly toward her afterward until only a small distance remained between them once more. Dawn light touched the side of his face now through the tall windows, softening the harshness of his expression without diminishing the intensity beneath it. You asked me earlier why I married you, he said quietly. Yes. This is the real answer. Serafina held his gaze steadily. Lucien continued before hesitation could interfere. Because every instinct I possessed told me you would either destroy my control completely, his voice lowered slightly, or become the first person I could not bear losing it around. The confession landed between them with almost unbearable weight. Serafina felt her breath catch softly. Lucien rarely spoke emotionally. When he did, Every word arrived with dangerous precision because restraint forced sincerity into sharp edges. "You barely knew me," she whispered. No, his eyes held hers steadily now. "I noticed you." Silence stretched quietly between them while pale morning light slowly replaced the fire's glow across the study walls. Serafina became aware suddenly of how close they stood again. Close enough to notice the exhaustion beneath his eyes. Close enough to feel warmth lingering between them despite the winter cold outside. "And now?" she asked softly. Lucien looked at her for several long seconds before answering. "Now I am trying very hard to remain rational." The truth of it moved visibly beneath every controlled line of his body. Serafina realized suddenly that Lucien had spent the entire night fighting himself far more than anyone else. Fighting instinct, attachment, desire, vulnerability. Yet every time he stepped back emotionally, he moved closer protectively instead. "That sounds exhausting too," she murmured. A faint shadow of humor touched his expression briefly. "You are remarkably consistent in identifying my flaws." "They are not flaws." Her voice softened. "They are wounds pretending to be discipline." That hit him. She saw it instantly in the subtle shift near his eyes before control returned once more. Lucien looked away briefly toward the fading fire. "You should not understand me this quickly. You should not make understanding you so easy." Another dangerous silence settled between them. Then suddenly rapid footsteps echoed once more through the outer corridor. This time accompanied by voices. Several voices. Lucien's expression cooled instantly. A second later Hargrove entered the study with visible urgency. "Your Grace. The guests have gathered downstairs already." Lucien straightened slowly. "News spreads quickly." "Yes, Your Grace." Hargrove hesitated before adding carefully, "Lady Hollowmere has returned again." Serafina felt the atmosphere sharpen immediately. Lucien merely nodded once. "Of course she has. She insists upon witnessing the morning announcements personally." Lucien's mouth shifted faintly. Not amusement. Something colder. "Excellent." Hargrove glanced between them uncertainly. "Shall I prepare additional security?" No, Lucien's gaze lifted toward Serafina instead. "Prepare the ballroom." "Immediately, Your Grace." The old servant withdrew quickly. Silence returned for one final moment afterward. Lucien crossed toward the study door before stopping abruptly beside Serafina. "One last chance," he said quietly, "to reconsider standing beside me publicly." Serafina stared at him. "You still think I frighten easily?" No, his eyes darkened slightly. "I think you still underestimate what standing beside me will cost." Serafina reached slowly toward the front of his loosened shirt collar then, smoothing one crooked fold near his throat with calm fingers. The contact lasted only seconds. Yet Lucien went perfectly still beneath it. "Lucien," she said softly, "I spent my entire life invisible." Her hand lowered slowly back to her side. "I think I would rather be destroyed beside someone real than protected beside people pretending." The room fell silent again. Lucien looked at her like a man standing at the edge of something irreversible. Then very slowly he reached toward her gloved hand and lifted it once to his lips beneath the pale morning light spilling through the windows. The gesture was brief, controlled, yet nothing about it felt performative. Serafina felt the truth of it instantly. So did he. Lucien lowered her hand carefully afterward, though his fingers lingered 1 second too long before releasing her entirely. "Stay beside me downstairs," he said quietly. "No matter what happens." Then he opened the study door and walked toward the ballroom with the cold authority of a duke prepared to dismantle an entire society's version of him in a single morning.